So we're going to have a chance for each of our panelists to tell us a little bit more about their operation, and they'll be talking about various items related to pathways to net zero. And then from there, we'll have a chance at the end. If you have any questions, we can have some Q&A. So first off, we're going to have Brett. In terms of a little background on Brett, he's the founder and CEO of Carbon One, a Canadian clean tech company operating in the carbon accounting and reporting space. Prior to founding Carbon One, Brett founded one of Canada's first sustainable business management consulting firms, Green Enterprise Movement, and led the organization to 14 years of consecutive growth, which certainly speaks to the increasing demand for the types of services he offers. In this role, Brett had the opportunity to work with over 200 North American food and beverage companies, from small startups to large publicly traded multinationals, advising on strategies to drive performance through a focus on sustainability. During this time, he was also a professor of sustainable business management at Seneca College in Toronto. Brett earned a BA in economics from Wilfrid Laurier and completed postgraduate work in environmental studies at Dalhousie. He lives in Toronto and is the author of 2 sustainability themed books, Green Intentions and Purposely Profitable. So, Brett, would you like to jump up here? Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here and kick things off this morning. So let's get this party started here. I'm going to talk about some trends related to carbon reporting that's going to be impacting the food and beverage industry in 2024. So the first trend here is all about regulations. So regulations around carbon reporting are heating up across the globe, and there's no time or signs of them slowing down anytime soon. So there's increasing regulations both here in Canada and abroad. Most notably here in Canada, you should be aware of the mandatory reporting for publicly traded companies to report their carbon emissions annually with their financial filings. And this includes what's known as Scope 3 emissions, if you're familiar with carbon accounting, which includes emissions from across the entire supply chain as well as the value chain there. And there's been some very recent developments on this regulation. So on March 13th, the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board released a draft of the standard that will be adopted for the regulations. It does include Scope 3. It's out for a 90-day public consultation, which will end on June 10th. At which time they will review, they're going to post the feedback over the summer and finalize the standard by the end of the year to be ready for adoption in January. At which time the Canadian Securities Administrators will adopt this and push this down to the various jurisdictions across the country. So Canada is not the only one doing this. On March 6th, the US SEC passed landmark climate disclosures requiring publicly traded companies in the US to report. This follows the adoption of mandatory reporting in the state of California. And of course, this follows what's been happening in the European Union and other jurisdictions across the globe. Beyond that, there's also additional regulations that are coming down the pipe, such as what's known as CBAM. So all these acronyms, the acronym soup here again, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism that will require, that will basically level the playing field between trading partners around carbon pricing. And that will be impacting sort of the ability to trade there. So, there's lots of stuff happening with regards to regulations around, carbon reporting. And what this means for food and beverage brands is even if you're not publicly traded or listed, you will still have to report due to the Scope 3 requirement. Right? So if you're selling to a retailer, their Scope 3 includes all of the products that they sold they sell in their stores. So you will be required to report the carbon footprint of each of your products to retailers going forward. And you need to start preparing now because there's going to be consequences. I can't speak for the retailers, but those consequences could be the risk of being delisted. And if you are exporting due to the foreign requirements for reporting, it could certainly impact your ability to export. The second trend is that, net zero is transforming the market, right? With commitments from the major retailers, major CPG players, and other organizations. And the list keeps growing, right? It seems like daily new commitments are being announced around net zero. In fact, and this stat is staggering to me, over 90% of global GDP is now covered under a net zero commitment, right? And the commitment is a serious commitment, right? Net zero is governed by an international standard through the Science Based Targets Initiative, and it includes Scope 3. It also has requirements to set both near-term and long-term targets for reduction. The food industry has a special pathway that they follow under the Food, Land, and Agriculture, or FLAG targets guidance that requires you to set near-term targets that are approximately a 30% reduction by 2030-ish. And then longer-term targets of over 70% by 2050. So again, what this means for food and beverage brands is even if you don't have a net zero target or commitment yourself, doesn't matter. If your customers do, you'll be required to show reductions and continually show progress over time. So you need to start measuring now because that's where it all begins, right? You need to start measuring first so you can put a plan and strategy in place for a reduction. And again, there's going to be consequences, right? What those consequences are, I can't speak for others, but there will be consequences. But it also does represent an opportunity, to differentiate yourself and grow market share. The third trend relates to the second trend in that there's mass confusion in the marketplace now with companies thinking that they can just buy their way to net zero, and that's just not the case. There's a big difference between carbon neutral and net zero. Carbon neutral does not require any targets to be set at all, does not require you to reduce your emissions at all. Scope 3 is optional, and you can use as many carbon credits as you want to get your way down to zero. Whereas with net zero, you have to set both near-term and long-term targets, as we saw. Scope 3 is required, and they restrict the use of carbon credits for how many carbon credits you can use. Right now, as it sits, really you're only allowed to use carbon credits to neutralize the residual emissions that remain after achieving your long-term credit. A little sort of asterisk to that last week there was an announcement made by the Science Based Targets Initiative that may provide more flexibility on the use of carbon credits for Scope 3. That was met with huge international backlash and internal chaos with that. So we'll see where all that lands. Regardless, you're not buying your way out of this. So companies need to realize that, right? So you need to be investing and realizing real reductions in your emissions to be able to meet those commitments. And of course, the entities who are going to be required to report and have these net zero commitments are feeling the pressure, and they're pushing that pressure downwards onto their supply chain. And we're talking with companies about this every single day, and we know that at least 2 of the major retailers have started sending out surveys to their key suppliers, asking what they're doing about this. And for folks who have been in this for a while, like with the packaging requirements and whatnot, that everything starts with a survey. So what this means for brands is that if you're not feeling the pressure yet, you will. You need to get prepared now, and you need to be able to respond and have a plan in place. And of course, the market is reacting, right? So what we're seeing is certainly some of the larger companies, but also more progressive companies who are starting to see this as an opportunity for a competitive advantage. A lot of the larger companies and even some of the SMEs out there have been doing sort of the Scope 1 and 2 stuff for a while, but most of the organizations across the country are not doing the Scope 3, but what we're starting to see is this voluntarily starting to happen, right? More and more companies are voluntarily reporting their Scope 3 emissions because they see it as a competitive advantage and a competitive opportunity to show leadership, sort of get ahead and be able to prepare for what's coming down the line there. So, what this means for food and beverage brands here in Canada is if you're not doing this stuff, you really need to get on it because you're going to fall further and further behind. And you're going to be forced to play catch up. There's risks associated with not getting on top of this, and you never really want to be in that position where you're forced to sort of play catch up there. Compounding this whole issue is the increased enforcement of greenwashing that's happening across the globe. Right? So environmental claims have been long scrutinized by the market. But what we're seeing is increased enforcement of bogus claims and claims without evidence. So in January, the European Union introduced some legislation that now requires any environmental claim made by a company to be backed up by science-based evidence. So, if you're going to make a climate claim or a claim about the greenness or sustainability of your products, you have to back that up with something like a life cycle assessment. We do have and see some regulations here in Canada about that. They're very sort of general and loosey-goosey, but we do know that Canada is looking at bringing in legislation or regulations similar to that that is in Europe now. And we're also seeing increased litigation in this area. So it really started over in the U.S. where we were seeing, cases go into the courts, but we're now starting to see that here in Canada, where it's not just the government, cracking down on this, but we're seeing, consumers and individuals and, associations that are now starting to take companies, to court over this. So brands are going to need to back up any of their environmental claims with science-based evidence, right? And if you don't, again, there's consequences to not doing this, right? Beyond all the regulatory and legal stuff around this, it really does erode consumer trust. But at the same time, it provides an opportunity for organizations who have the ability, to back up these claims. Last week, I was talking to the ESG lead for one of the big four accounting firms, and he was telling me what he's starting to see with some of his clients and some of the larger clients is this trend of what's called green hushing, right? Where companies are afraid to be talking about some of the great stuff that they're doing, but there's no reason to be afraid if you've got the evidence to back it up, and it certainly provides an opportunity if you can do that. So I'll sort of finish off with the last trend here, which is more of a good news trend. In response to all of this, what we're seeing is a handful of technology companies across the globe who are starting to bring to market technologies that are changing the game for carbon accounting and reporting. The tech for Scope 1 and 2 carbon accounting and reporting has been around for quite a while. There's nothing really new there, but what's new is the tech around Scope 3. Right? So this technology that's coming into a market from a handful of companies from across the globe is dramatically and exponentially reducing both the cost and the time in order to be able to do this. And in some cases, up to and over a 90% reduction in cost and time. Beyond that, these technologies are addressing the issue of complexity because Scope 3 is very complex, right? When you're doing these life cycle assessments, you're talking about dozens of calculations using dozens of data points that are difficult to find the data for. So some of the better solutions out there on the market have solutions that require no previous knowledge or experience, can be done very quickly, and they're being done at comparable or even higher accuracy of calculations than can be done through traditional consultancies, right? And there's a number of reasons behind that. So we know what this means for food and beverage brands is, if you can choose the right tech partner, and a shameless plug, we're one of a handful of companies across the globe who have brought to market a technology like this. And we are the only company in Canada who is specifically focused on doing this for the food and beverage sector here in Canada. That's why we are founded. We're a purpose-driven organization that is focused on fighting climate change in collaboration with Canadian food and beverage companies. You want to make sure that you choose the right solution that is out there. They're not all the same. You want someone who understands your industry and the nuances, particularly in the food and beverage industry, that there's no previous knowledge or experience required, that the data that's being used provides a high level of accuracy. What we see is higher the accuracy, lower the footprint. And it sort of makes sense because it, sort of looks at, all of the current, agricultural practices on a farm, so on and so forth. So with that, just a quick summary here. We've got regulations coming down the pipe. Net zero is transforming the market. You're not buying your way out of this. The retailers and large listed companies are feeling the pressure. That's coming down onto the supply chain. Companies are starting to respond. Right? And, sort of complicating things is this enforcement of greenwashing, but the technology is there to do it. So, we believe that before 2030, carbon accounting and reporting will become as commonplace as financial accounting and reporting. And I'll finish off by saying this. The pathway to net zero starts with measurement, and if you're not at the table, you're going to be on the menu. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Brett. Good way to start things off, even if it is a bit jarring in terms of some of the requirements that are coming forward. Next off, I'll introduce Mats, and certainly if anybody has questions, if you want to jot them down, then at the end we can certainly cover those off. Mats is a certified engineer, certified energy manager with a degree in energy engineering. He manages projects that reduce energy and water consumption and minimize product loss. Through his work, he helps companies on their journey towards becoming carbon neutral while saving money. Mats has been with Enviro-Stewards for the past 3 years, which is a Best for the World classified B Corp, recipient of a Global Compact Canada's SDG Goal Award, and the only Canadian company to win a global SDG award. Enviro-Stewards sustainability engineering work for organizations like Bimbo Canada, Maple Leaf Foods, Andrew Peller, Maple Lodge, the Walmart Foundation, and Tim Hortons have each won national awards. So I'd now like to invite Mats.
Thanks, Dyson, and thanks for getting us together through the CFIN network. Even yesterday, it was really inspiring to hear what's already happening in Atlantic, Canada, and I'm excited to share about what we do. Thanks, Brett, for your talk and setting the stage for what's required in terms of carbon accounting. And through our work with Enviro-Stewards, we hope that we can fill some of the need for also reducing emissions once you do start reporting them. So, my name is Mats van Kleef. I'm with Enviro-Stewards, and I'll talk about a profitable path to achieving carbon neutral. And Enviro-Stewards is a consulting company just north of Waterloo, Ontario. And our mission statement is to cultivate resilient businesses and improve lives in extraordinary ways. And as a founding Canadian B Corp, we really care about having that impact in addition to being profitable. We're not just a B Corp. There's strict requirements to show that you're doing social good in the world, but we're also award-winning in each of the categories that we get measured in. And we're the only Canadian company that won a Global SDG Award, and through many of our projects, we've won Clean 50 awards. So what I'll talk about today, I'll outline a profitable path to affordably reaching net zero. It can be really expensive buying your way out of it, and that's kind of the common perception that is out there. But by reducing your emissions, you're actually able to save money, and like Brett mentioned, it's actually the only credible way to do it. Buying your way out of it with credits just won't cut it down the line. So I'll share a few case studies of how we've done this with some of our clients, and I'll talk through our approach, how we can help you do this as well. And like Tyson mentioned, there's funding available to actually help you implement some of these conservation assessments. And so the payoff, you'll have higher margins because you're actually conserving the utilities that are leading to these emissions, or conserving product and having additional revenue because of the product that you save, a smaller footprint as you reduce your impact, and brand stewardship. So one case study Brett had on his slide too, Maple Leaf is pushing for this. Maple Leaf set a target back in 2015 to become, or to reduce their emissions 50% by 2025. And so they asked us to come and help them find opportunities to reduce their emissions, first at a few facilities, and they liked our approach. They got us to go into all 35 facilities across Canada. And as a result, we identified opportunities where they could conserve utilities, reduce food waste, that actually to date have saved $17 million. And so this is kind of a case where it's not costing a company money to reduce their emissions. It actually has a significant impact on their bottom line as well. And they use that revenue, the additional revenue from the $17 million that they saved, to invest that in carbon offsets as a temporary measure. It's not a sustainable long-term strategy to always be investing in carbon offsets, but it is a temporary fix. And they're credible in the sense that even though they purchase offsets for that remaining amount at the time, they continue to make progress to bring their emissions down further and further. And as a result, in 2019, they were able to say that they were the first major carbon neutral food company while also increasing profitability. A great example is Southbrook Vineyards. We worked with them. They were already LEED Gold certified. They had great agricultural regenerative practices. And they were doing great work in terms of energy efficiency. And they asked an energy efficiency company to come in and do an audit, and just kind of a high-level assessment only identified 5% savings with a 20-year payback time. But they asked Bruce, our founder, to come in and do a kind of a second opinion. And through our assessment, by installing sensors right in the process and understanding how the operation works, we were actually able to find 40% savings, still with a 4-month payback time. So there's huge gains to be had, even for those companies that think they're already doing really well. And as a result, by reducing that amount of electricity, they were actually, they had been planning to install solar panels to offset the remaining electricity that they were using. But as a result, they only required to install a third fewer solar panels, and that didn't need to replace vineyards. So as a result, they were actually able to save $20,000 worth of wine that they were producing as well. Walmart Foundation is another group that we've worked with. Sometimes it's through surveys that that the companies will try to find what the reporting is like and encourage suppliers to reduce emissions. But in this case, the Walmart Foundation provided funding, and they asked us to go into 50 food and beverage facilities across Canada to find the most low-hanging fruit food waste opportunities. And on average, with the companies that we worked with, we found $230,000 per year worth of food savings with a less than 1-year payback time. And so it's not costing money for these companies to reduce their emissions. There's actually still so much opportunity to reduce emissions while saving money. And on average, those projects saved $350 for every ton of GHG emissions that was avoided. Some local companies, we've worked with Clearwater here to do an energy and water conservation assessment. We found opportunities there to reduce water by 25% and electricity use by 17%. And some examples include the type of pump that they were using to bring ocean water into their facility for cooling. And the pump was running at a steady amp load continuously, but the water demand was fluctuating. And by installing a different type of pump, they actually were able to modulate kind of the amount of energy that was used based on the water that was coming into the facility. Another example is this hose going to the drain was flowing at 22 liters per minute of chilled water, and that was just there to prevent a heat exchanger from freezing up that they were using for cooling. And by circulating water or changing the set points so that equipment like that shuts off instead of running and preventing freezing in kind of alternative ways, you can prevent that 22 liters per minute of chilled water from going down the drain. And so our path, we specialize in the scope 1 and 2 emissions that then become scope 3 emissions for those companies down the supply chain. And we do that by installing sensors. We quantify for a week at a minute-by-minute level to see which processes are using the energy and water in your facility. And through this logging, we can actually see the operating conditions and find really unique ways to conserve energy, as opposed to the typical recommendations and reports that you'll find where it's just replacing it with a very expensive, just slightly more efficient model of a piece of equipment. And so through our logging, we're actually able to find kind of operating changes where you might change controls or change behavior that have much more significant impacts, and those are low-hanging fruit opportunities, or using waste heat from one process to preheat another one as kind of deep retrofits that can help you decarbonize as well. And then we do look at those remaining emissions that are still left after you've done the credible work to reduce emissions as much as possible, to find credible projects that have SDG co-benefits, social benefits, to replace the remaining amount. One example of our work, this is a company we worked with that had this process, chemical process, where fumes were coming out of a still bottoms tank, and it was creating a hazardous environment for workers. So there was a wall exhaust fan that was exhausting those fumes outside. And so a traditional energy audit might look at the electricity consumed by that fan and install a VFD or replace it with a more efficient fan and save on electricity. Or a traditional thermal audit might install a heat exchanger to recover some of that heat going out the building and save that. But our approach to get to the root cause of issues is to actually try to understand why it's happening in the first place. And so in this case, these tanks were venting fumes and creating the hazardous work environment. And so we proposed, can we cover the tanks and actually route these fumes back into the process, into the condenser, so that you can sell it again as a reclaimed solvent. And as a result, they no longer have the hazardous fumes, so you're creating a much better work environment for the workers. You reduce the toxic emissions to the atmosphere. You're reducing your supply chain footprint because you're not having to purchase as much material to sell the same amount of product. And as a result, you don't even need that wall fan, so you save 100% of the electricity and 100% of the heat that's going out the building. Another one is this process that was using a centrifuge to discharge some lard out of the process, and they were flowing 22 liters per minute of hot water down the drain just to prevent their lines from clogging up to the sewer. And so what it's designed for, that 22 liters per minute of hot water, is serving the purpose that it was intended for. But the question is, can we do this in a more effective way? And so in this case, we proposed to close off that tank, not send it to the sewer anymore, close it up, heat trace it so that it wouldn't freeze up, and direct that lard back into the process so that you save the lard. And as a result, you're able to sell 1,200 liters per day additional of lard. You save all that 22 liters per minute of water going down the drain. The energy needed to heat that water, and the significant cost there was the effluent chemicals and the sludge disposal at the end. So there's often many additional benefits when you really tackle the root cause of issues that are happening in your facility. And so what does this monitoring look like? We can either install rented equipment for a week, or we can install permanent meters on those processes where you want to monitor kind of changes over time. So these are graphs of an air compressor where just naturally you're going to develop more leaks over time, and getting notifications when that gets out of kind of a normal level is really helpful to stay on top of things, to save money and to save those emissions associated with utilities. And so a lot of times we'll be there at the beginning of the process to help identify those opportunities, and that's our kind of first deliverable. And then depending on what the needs are in your facility, we can support with conceptual engineering design. We can continue to monitor and verify to help you apply for grant funding, do the project management, kind of whatever gaps there are within your organization, or we can get the quotes from those suppliers to do the more detailed engineering work. And so in the end, kind of to Brett's point about tracking and reporting your emissions, in this case, you'll know exactly where you're starting from in terms of your Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and not just on the level of your utility bills, but you can pinpoint it down to the individual processes. And through implementing measures, you can kind of chart out your path of how you're going to achieve your goals, whether that's 50% by 2030 or net zero, or whether you have a carbon neutral goal as a stepping stone in between. And by assigning dates to each of these implementation measures, you can see if you're on track and saving the emissions that you're intending to. But also by measuring this and showing how you're making progress, you're able to elevate your brand and tell a compelling story to your clients as well. We've done a few creative projects ourselves. At our office in Waterloo, we have a blue roof where we store water on the roof, and this helps with evaporative cooling in the summer. So this has been a really exciting project. But more importantly, as the effects of climate change become more severe and we have more intense storms, the municipal infrastructure can't actually handle this amount of stormwater going down the drain. And by holding water on the roof during a big storm event, we're actually able to help reduce the demand on the storm sewer and prevent flooding, and also reduce the amount of capital needed to upgrade infrastructure down the line. We use this rainwater for our living well in the office and for flushing toilets, but it can be used for all sorts of purposes. And as a result, with a living wall, we freshen the air in the office so much that we don't need to exhaust as much of that warm air in the wintertime, so that we also don't have to reheat the air coming in. So this is saving 97% air exchange and also having a significant impact on our own emissions that way. And so with the offsets, there's kind of two approaches that you can take. Traditionally, there have been people buying credits on the open market, and there's more and more concern just about the credibility around some of those. And so we really encourage our clients to partner with an inspiring project that you feel comfortable defending. And so for Southbrook, they decided to install solar panels on their farm. Unilever purchased renewable energy credits to directly offset the energy that they consumed. Maple Leaf purchased Canadian credits, and they continue to do conservation so that they can show the credibility of their path that way. And Bruce was thinking about this for our office, our founder, and instead of putting solar panels on our roof in Ontario, where we have limited daylight and we already have a very clean electricity grid, he instead opted to go to South Sudan and invest in a project there to commission solar panels on the roof of an orphanage. And in South Sudan, they get twice the useful daylight. The orphanage's electricity was coming from diesel power, so that's 10 times dirtier than Ontario's grid. And as a kind of a social side benefit, the money that orphanage was spending on diesel could instead be spent on food and education. And there are similar projects on larger scales where they're developing run-of-the-river hydro and looking for active investment to provide clean energy for the communities there. So there are projects at all levels that you can invest in. But Bruce decided to put some of the profit of Enviro-Stewards into Safe Water Social Ventures, an organization to train entrepreneurs to provide safe water filters for their community. By training entrepreneurs, you're empowering the people locally to do the work, to source local materials and hire local employees. And so this has been a really meaningful way to give back as a B Corp, and also have an impact on offsetting water consumption or reducing or offsetting emissions when firewood isn't needed anymore to boil that water. And so I'll leave it at that. I'm looking forward to the conversation later, just in terms of kind of the overall picture. We can help quantify your Scope 1 and 2 baseline, find those conservation measures, and then think creatively about ways that we can offset the remaining amounts. I'm looking forward to the conversations throughout the rest of the day. Thank you. Thank
you, Mats, and good job getting by the spot there. We don't want anyone to fall off here. So that's wonderful, and definitely I definitely, obviously, there's a lot of investments up front when you're looking at, or there are some investments up front, but certainly looking at doing the right thing, maintaining your listings, and also having a payback that makes a lot of sense as a business is a great combination. And next up, we're going to have Dawne Skinner, co-founder and chief innovation officer of Acuicy, an environmental engineer with over 20 years of industry experience and expertise in circular supply chains. She's a passionate climate activist who's excited to be using her expertise to scale access to the business intelligence that companies need to reduce their emissions. Dawne is also a PhD candidate in industrial engineering at Dalhousie University.
Good morning, everyone. Really happy to be here. Happy to see so many excited and enthusiastic faces. I am, first of all, one of the values of Acuicy, of myself and my co-founder, is Indigenous reconciliation. So I just want to start with a land acknowledgement. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, my apologies. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people signed with the British Crown in 1725. Indigenous peoples are the original sustainability experts, and we can learn so much from them. Settlers are newcomers to this space, so I really acknowledge everything that they bring to the table in this space. I would also like to acknowledge Tyson's brilliance in putting together this panel. So while it may seem as I'm going through this that we actually are competitors, we are actually brilliant channel partners. So let's talk later about how we can action that strategy. So as Tyson mentioned, I am the Chief Innovation Officer and co-founder of Acuicy. What Acuicy does is we are leveraging AI to take the guesswork out, the financial guesswork out of cutting carbon. I wasn't sure where everybody was at in their knowledge of emissions profiles, so I just wanted to review where your emission profile, or all of your emissions come from. So scope 1, 2, generally they are within your own organization. They tend to be under your control for the most part, and that include direct GHG emissions, so any fuels that you burn on site, that's scope 1. Any electricity, power, steam that you buy from another organization, that would be your scope 2. And then scope 3 is this big beast that everybody's grappling with. There are 15 categories of scope 3, essentially all of the emissions in your upstream and downstream value chain. And so those are, there's a lot of folks, as Mark mentioned, or Brett, my apologies, mentioned, that are trying to grapple with this. And so Acuicy can actually help with all 3 scopes. So what's the problem for business? Most of you already know, you're probably selling into retail. You've got customers who are asking you to decarbonize. The problem is that you're a smaller organization, you don't have in-house sustainability expertise, you can't afford to hire. Consultants are pretty expensive these days, and to be quite honest, sustainability has exploded so quickly, we just don't have the pipeline of talent that is needed to fill everybody's needs. And so recognizing this, we actually decided to build Acuicy. We were consultants, we were doing this manually on a one-to-one basis, and we recognized it's just not scalable. And we needed to get the business intelligence into as many hands or into as many businesses as possible to be able to decarbonize as quickly as possible. So we basically automated a lot of what we were already doing as consultants. We decided that we needed to make Acuicy really easy to use. So if you don't have a sustainability expert in-house, that's okay. We basically take your business information, you fill in a brief survey, and then when you hit submit, we use AI and machine learning to generate the top low carbon options for you automatically. We also generate your scope 1 and 2 if you don't already use carbon accounting. So if you use carbon accounting, we will provide a plugin so you can download that information directly to Acuicy. And what we say, we're the missing middle. So we are not accounting, we're not reporting. We are the what, we've got our numbers, now what do we do? So we provide you with the business case for a range of low carbon options. So then you can, filter based on your own internal criteria. So you've got a CFO who demands a 2-year payback period. You can filter for a 2-year payback period. You've got $5,000 in the bank that's available next year. You can filter for 5,000 CapEx. And then you can plan your journey to net zero based on what you can afford or your ambitions. And once you get those results, then you would go to someone like Matt's, and they would be able to give you like a quote. They would help you with your project management. So we're a full suite of service up here. For those enterprises that are further along generally in their Scope 1 and 2 emissions, they're now starting to try and tackle Scope 3. What's happening right now is there's no really easy way to reach out to all your suppliers and incentivize them to reduce emissions. So if any of you have gone through the process of trying to incentivize the decision makers in your own organization to reduce your Scope 1 and 2 emissions, you know how hard it is to influence, even within your own organization. So if you've got suppliers, how do you influence them? How do you incentivize them to reduce emissions? Right now, a lot of companies are reaching out one-to-one. So they're hiring consultants or they're hiring internally. They're trying to help companies calculate their Scope 1 and 2 emissions and then somehow advise them on how to reduce their emissions. They don't understand their supplier's business. It's not a scalable solution. It's not an effective solution, and it's really time and dollar costly. So we actually automated this. So what happens is Acuicy can be deployed by procurement to their supply chain. Suppliers sign on to their Scope 1 and 2 module that we just went through. They fill in their information about their business, hit submit, they get the business intelligence they need. They also get their Scope 1 and 2 emissions if, again, they're not using carbon accounting. That data then gets laddered up into a net zero dashboard at the enterprise level. So then they can then drill down into their hotspots. They can track their performance towards their target. And then instead of like the spray and pray approach, they can actually target their support to the ones that actually need it the most. And so that's Acuicy in a nutshell. We can handle your Scope 1 and 2, Scope 3. We can also do financed emissions, which is for banks, investors, and insurance companies that need to reduce their emissions in their lending and investment portfolios. What users are saying about Acuicy, we've been lucky enough to just finish a pilot, or we are finishing up a pilot with the agri-food industry. We've also been working with a lot of other companies in different industries. And we've got a lot of really positive feedback that what we are building is something that is needed, and it fills a niche that's not available yet. So this is awesome. Myself and my co-founder have almost 50 years of experience combined. Allison led sustainability strategies in large multinationals, so she really understands the enterprise struggle. And I've been a consultant for 20 plus years, and again, using predictive analytics for optimized supply chains. So again, if you're interested in joining us, we are launching our beta. So we are still early stage. We are launching our beta in May. So you can either chat with me about how you might join us, or you can reach out at support@acuicy.com. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Lots of insights and lots of things to think about for sure. Just want to open things up. We're going to be super casual today. If anybody has a question, if you want to raise your hand, be the brave person to ask that first question, that would be great. Otherwise, I have a quick one for the group. In terms of what you've noticed, each of you have worked with a lot of companies, a lot of food companies and a lot of other companies in this area. What do you find is the difference between the companies that really make progress and tackle things and get results? Like, what is there a few things that you're noticing from those companies that you're like, if these are the first, couple of things that if you have this in hand, then it really makes a difference? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, Tyson. I think knowing, like having the data and knowing what to do with it is really important. So whether it's through reporting, through kind of the systems that my colleagues here provided, or knowing the data on a minute-by-minute process. Just a lot of companies don't know where they could be saving, and it's often as simple as turning off a valve where hot water's flowing to the drain, or changing operating parameters. And once companies see what there is in their own operations, it's amazing how quickly they shift gears to actually implement those measures. It's not necessarily that a company has to have a huge drive to become sustainable, because many of these measures just have an amazing ROI. It just makes a lot of sense to save these emissions that way.
Cool.
I would say leadership. Companies that have embedded sustainability into their strategy and have owners and CEOs that are really driving that change, I think is key. We also see the companies that are taking strides towards this have moved beyond the why, which we've been working on for 20 years, and it's now, okay, the how. So they've reached that point where it's like, we know we've got to do something, and so now we're committed and we're going to get this done.
Yeah, I would echo those comments, particularly the leadership thing. You know, to me, what differentiates a good company from a great company is the leadership and the culture. To add to that, I would say awareness, right? So, you know, I think, you know, once people understand, you know, what this is all about and the opportunity, and that, you know, sustainability isn't some sort of left, you know, tree hugger movement that's nice to work on, you have extra time on your hands. You know, when you understand, you know, to quote the late great Ray Anderson, that, you know, sustainability is a better way to make a bigger profit. And when you actually start seeing that and you gain awareness on that, I think that's a huge driver for companies to keep things moving forward.
Great, thank you. Any questions from anyone out there?
What's the process, or what's going to be required of small suppliers?
That's a great question.
Yeah, from, you know, a carbon accounting and reporting perspective, you know, it doesn't matter if you're, you know, not a large publicly traded company. You know, if you're feeding into or selling to these larger companies, you're part of their scope 3 emissions, right? So not only will you be required to do the accounting and reporting to them, but, you know, they have these net zero commitments, so you're going to be required to realize those reductions and to be able to show continual, you know, improvement and reductions over time. So it's the kicker here with all of this is the scope 3 piece, right? So when you introduce that scope 3 piece, that's when it really sort of, you know, brings in the entire supply chain.
Yeah, I would say, so we're actually built out for SMEs. We can do on-farm emission reduction options, including nature-based solutions, circular economy work. And we built that recognizing, so surprisingly, although like farms tend to be owned by small businesses, the raw material extraction portion of the value chain is usually the hot spot. And so there's a lot of pressure right now to reduce that hot spot in a lot of companies. So, you know, I've been speaking with big banks. They're trying to reduce their scope 3, which includes their financed emissions, and they know their hot spot is agri-food and oil and gas. So there's going to be a lot of scrutiny. Yeah, we're here for you.
Yeah, great question. On the one hand, my thoughts go to my parents. They're farmers, and on a very small scale, just 4 or 5 employees, and they were always tuned in to where they could save their utilities. They had greenhouses, so natural gas was a big expense, and they really noticed the competitive advantage they could have by reducing their emissions. And there's funding available for those kinds of capital investments that directly impact the natural gas emissions. And when it comes to kind of installing the sensors that we provide, funding like is being provided by CFIN through the Unpuzzling grant, I think really makes it accessible for small companies to find those kinds of opportunities and make a strong business case for implementing them.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from anyone? Yes, Mark.
Yeah, just from a context of startup, what do you think those companies should be doing at those early stages to prepare for the point where they actually, if they become mandated, that they report their carbon accounts?
Yeah, great question. So we're working with a few organizations and associations in the cellular agriculture and precision fermentation sort of sector that aren't commercialized yet. And the way that we're seeing them use our technology is from a product development perspective, right? So as you're developing products, as you're also, looking at, business development, they're running scenarios saying, okay, so, this is an energy intensive business. If we locate in this province versus this province based on the, grid factors on how power is produced in that province, what does that footprint look like, right? If we use this ingredient instead of that ingredient, how does that impact our footprint? So, I really see it being used, and this was news to us, right? We're like, yeah, we're going to count numbers. And then, companies started coming back to us going, oh, we can use this for product development, right? We can use this for business development to make those sort of decisions.
We really have to talk. My PhD is actually optimizing supply chains for cell ag. So we have a lot of intersecting interests. I would say optimizing supply chain, and that includes operation, your scope 1 and 2. I know, Mark, you're super interested in looking at like upcycling, revalorization. All of those things are so important. And so before you start investing in facilities, having that information up front so that you know that you're optimizing for, great inputs, circular economy, and emissions, I think would be critical.
Yeah, that scenario is kind of the dream, and as consultants, it maybe shoots ourselves in the foot a little bit by offering advice before you implement, because there'd be more work to try and fix the problem afterwards than addressing it in advance. But by looking at drawings, you're actually able to have kind of a different lens at it, where your focus is very much on how do I get my production process working effectively, being able to provide perspective from what we've seen in industry and other places with a lens of how can you make the operations more cost effective by reducing the utilities that are required to operate your process. It's so much more cost effective to have that thought be put into it in the early stages than trying to fix it after the fact. I was just at a facility in Kansas last week where they were asking, what were these guys thinking when it was designed 10 years ago, sending hot condensate down the drain instead of returning it to the steam boiler? And now in hindsight, it's so difficult to change it because space is constrained and it's going to require a lot of effort to run that piping back through walls. So if you have that thought process in the design early on, it makes a huge difference.
Just to add one thing here on the upcycling piece and this whole circularity thing. So we're working with a few companies right now where there is a very special way that you do carbon accounting for upcycled ingredients. It's based on the polluter pays principle, in this case, the polluter benefits type thing. But we've got a smaller organization that we're working with that actually has a facility here in Nova Scotia as well as one in Ontario. And when we did the carbon accounting for their upcycled ingredients, the way that it works is you actually receive an upcycled ingredient into your facility at 0 carbon. So for example, the average rough footprint of like a potato, for example, is about 204 grams per kilo of potato. But when you take an upcycled potato, you actually receive that potato at 0, right? So there's an incentive to adopt this upcycled circularity approach. And then what they're doing is they're then selling that, turning that into a potato powder and selling that to a large publicly traded company here in Canada, because they're using that to reduce their scope 3 emissions, right? So it's kind of like insetting versus offsetting, right? Where, you're investing in your supply chain as opposed to, buying these external carbon credits. So, there's some very interesting sort of scenarios that you can play around with here if you're looking at that stuff.
Awesome, thank you. For I think the need to kind of stay on time, I think we're going to wrap things up. So if everybody could thank our first panel, that'd be great. Thank you.